Okay, so today, May 24th, 2018, we're at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, and we have the pleasure of recording the oral history of Stan Honey.
Hello, I'm Stan Honey.
So Stan was pioneered the development of the ETAK Navigator, which was the first practical navigation system for automobiles. He founded the company ETAK, which built the Navigator and manufactured it, put it into automobiles. But his contributions are more widely known through sports television viewing. Now, the company that Stan co-founded was responsible for putting the 1st and 10 line marker on your screen, miraculously appearing without obscuring the players, and also the strike zone marker for baseball, and even tracking the pitch into the strike zone. Now, it all started with tracking a hockey puck, which was in some cases considered a distraction. But later achievements were really quite well received, in particular the marking the racing cars and NASCAR races so you could have split screen viewing of those vehicles, and then finally marking the LiveLine in sailboat racing to greatly enhance viewer appreciation of sailboat racing. Now, regarding sailboat racing, it's not uncommon for the icons of Silicon Valley to take up sailboat racing to demonstrate their mastery of extreme challenges. But with Stan, it was quite different. Sailing for you started when you were very young. You had mastered sailing and right now hold just about, I think, every major sailing award that's out there. And it was through your mastery of sailing that you made the connections that really led to what we now recognize as augmented reality, another fascinating chapter in the history of computing. So start from the beginning and tell us your story.
Well, you kind of gave a quick overview. I went to Yale undergraduate, was on the sailing team, studied engineering and applied science. I decided I wanted to go to Stanford graduate school, so I only applied for companies in the San Francisco Bay Area that were part of the Honors Co-op program. Ended up taking a job at SRI International, which was my lowest offer, but the interviews at SRI indicated to me that it was the most fascinating place to work. And I largely went there to work with guys like Walt Zivoli and Alan Phillips because I was absolutely staggered with the process of interviewing with those guys. So I was at SRI for 78 through 83. They did put me through the Honors Co-op program, so I ended up with my master's at Stanford. And then in 1983, co-founded ETAK. And we did co-found it, and the other original founders were Alan Phillips and Ken Milnes. And then very quickly, we hired several others from SRI, George Loffmiller, Jamie Buxton, Jerry Russell. Walt Zivoli came along shortly, Larry Sweeney, a number of years later. So there was definitely an SRI technical core at ETAK. And then Marv White was a key early employee on the mathematics and digital map side, and he came from the U.S. Census Bureau. So that was the original core technical group at ETAK. And ETAK did come from the sailing side to some extent, in that I had been sailing recreationally ever since I was a kid, but I started sailing professionally right after college as a navigator, navigating on ocean racing boats. And I was hired.
Tell us a little more about that early background. Your parents were sailors, or your father and your godfather?
Yeah, my dad was a sailor, and so he always either had a boat or there was a boat he could borrow, and so we'd often go to Catalina on the weekends. I grew up in Southern California. And then we were members of LA Yacht Club, and I was active there as a junior, racing everything from the 8-foot guppies to lasers. And then early on, for reasons that I'm not completely sure, but I developed an interest in navigation. And I was also interested in technology, and I was a ham radio operator, and I was building my own radios as a kid. But my interest in navigation seemed separate at the time, because navigation then, it was mathematical, because you were doing dead reckoning and celestial, but it wasn't technical, it wasn't electronic. It was just, sort of the interesting, mathematics of the celestial navigation and of dead reckoning. And so I developed an interest in navigation, and by the time I was a teenager, I was being asked to navigate in ocean racing down to Mexico and the Hawaii race and whatnot. But again, in those days, it was 100% traditional dead reckoning and celestial. And so then, through that time, I was a teenager at LA Yacht Club. I was racing in, lasers, crewing in offshore ocean racers, and then also acting as the navigator in many of those offshore races.
Okay, and that was also your decision to go to Yale was motivated in part by the sailing that was there?
That's right. Yale had I think the best sailing team in the country at the time. And so when I was accepted there, I got a number of phone calls from the guys in the sailing team encouraging me to go, so it was irresistible.
So they already knew you.
Yeah, sailing is a small world, so I knew them and they knew me, and so they called saying, "Oh, you got to come," and so that was irresistible. So I'd never been there before, I'd never done the sort of tour of colleges the way kids often do nowadays. So my first time showing up in New Haven is when I, showed up in September. But it was a fabulous experience, and then Yale stayed ranked first in the nation in college sailing the entire years I was there. And then
so you have to adapt to East Coast sailing?
Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah.
And I was on the team with Peter Eisler and Steve Benjamin, and the three of us were roommates for 3 of the 4 years we were at Yale. And the 3 of us lived out at the yacht club for 3 of the 4 years we were there. And the 3 of us remain very close friends. In fact, I'm going to Peter Eisler's wedding in a few days.
Oh. Okay. And so from the sailing now back to
sailing,
ETAK?
So I was asked to navigate Nolan Bushnell's boat in the Transpac in 1983. And through
Is that how you met him? Or?
Yeah, that's how I got to know Nolan. Nolan had decided he wanted to try to win the Transpac, and he had hired some local guys, Bruce Monroe and Steve Taft, to get a boat designed and built focused on winning the Transpac and being first to finish in the Transpac. And then those guys in turn hired me to navigate it because at the time I had, even by then I developed somewhat of a good reputation as a navigator, and I'd been first to finish in the 79 Transpac. And so they hired me to be the navigator and to sort out the electronics on the boat. And so that's how I met Nolan. And then in preparation for that race, I roped Ken Milnes in, and he's been a partner of mine ever since we first met at SRI. But I roped Ken Milnes into the project, and we built a navigation sort of performance management computer for the boat that analyzed the boat's performance as a function of wind speed and wind angle, helped me compute the fastest course given the forecast, analyzed the performance of other competing boats based on their morning roll calls. And it also actually copied and printed out weatherfax maps, which is an analog.
What computers were you using at that time?
That was based on an NSC 800, which was a CMOS version of the Z80.
Okay.
And actually, Taylor Washburn helped with some of the software. So I roped Taylor in on the side.
So the SRI connections.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, the whole world weaves in and out. So in any event, Ken and I built that system for Charlie. We ended up being first to finish in the Transpac. We didn't win on corrected time, but we were first to finish, which was the goal.
Was there any question about the legality of using sophisticated computers for enhancing the sailing or anything like that?
The rules have changed through the years, and obviously I've never done anything that's not been permitted, although I've done things aggressively once they are permitted. But the rules have changed, and early on you were limited to only using celestial navigation, and then at some point in the early 80s or late 70s they permitted you to use transit satellite navigation and then ultimately GPS. And then there was a period where you couldn't use programmable, computers on board the boat, but you could use a calculator. And of course, those boundaries get hard to define with time as, calculators become programmable. And so then the rules have changed through the years. And so now, and even then, the rules were then the way they are now, which is there's no limit to what you can do on board in terms of computer processing. The only limit is on what you can receive from outside the boat. So you're limited in not receiving outside assistance. So you're permitted to get any data that's available to everybody and is free, but you're not permitted to get custom advice from off the boat.
So you use a radar for surface monitoring?
Oh yeah, we can use radar.
That's okay now.
And radar has been, I think it's always been legal for use on boats. And we use radar to, some races we use it to detect ice and to, detect fishing boats so we don't hit them. And then we also use it to detect rainfall and squalls. And even in the Transpac, we use it to detect squalls, to track squalls so that you can get in front of them and take advantage of them. And then there's been speculation. In fact, you and I worked on, proposed a project some years ago about using radar to, measure wind at a distance.
Yeah. So are these just the conventional shipboard radars that were being used, or are they modified?
Yeah, these are all X-band radars. And it's an interesting thing. In fact, it'd be fun to discuss with you some. But those radars up until recently have been, pulse magnetron X-band radars. And then more recently, they're FMCW, but still X-band. And then the FMCW have some advantages in resolution, but some disadvantages in detection of weak targets at a distance. And so there's trade-offs. So for what I do, I still prefer the pulse magnetron radars because they're better at tracking precipitation and they're better at finding weak targets at a distance. But there's interesting evolution now.
Yeah, that's a whole separate topic. So coming back to ETAK.
Right.
Yeah, so ETAK then started, and what kind of technical challenges now did you have to overcome in ETAK? That was
so it was during that Transpac actually that I got to know, and then the practices leading up to the Transpac, that I got to know Nolan. And Nolan was a fascinating guy. In fact, we remain friends till today, and I have dinner with him maybe once a year. But Nolan was always interested in technology, and particularly in technologies that could have a consumer market. And he had founded Pizza Time. He was in the middle of Pizza Time Theater, the growth. He had founded Atari. He and Al Alcorn had invented the video game. So his interest was in the use of technology for the consumer market. And so, during the times that we'd spend together socially before the race and during the race, he would ask me, what kinds of things am I working on at SRI? And to the extent I could talk about it, I'd tell him. And then he was always interested in the consumer applications of that. And he was intrigued by the navigation computer that Ken and I built for the Transpac on his yacht Charlie. But Nolan wasn't interested in the business of providing computers for ocean racing. That was a market that had...
Too small.
Yeah, it was too small, and he had no interest in it. But nevertheless, he was saying, what could you do? Where do you think there's a technical ability to do something for a consumer market? And of course, my lifelong interest has been in navigation. And so I told him that, I'd thought about that some, and that I actually thought that it was now possible to build, meaning the computing power was sufficient, to build a vehicle navigation system. And you didn't have to wait for GPS. Because GPS in those days, 1983, had been proposed, but it hadn't been fielded, and it was still a number of years away. And so my proposal was you could build a navigation system that could dead reckon. It could measure the distance and direction that you travel, but then it would figure out where you are by cross-correlating against the available roads in the digital map database that are in the vicinity. And given the fact that drivers tend to drive on roads, it would figure out where you are by cross-correlating or matching between the pattern you'd driven and the available paths in the map database. And it would use that cross-correlation to eliminate the accumulation of error and also to improve the calibration of the sensors. And Nolan, is a really smart guy, so he instantly saw how that would work. And he instantly saw the synergies that you need the digital map database anyway to display to the viewer and to the driver and to compute paths and find addresses, and how that digital map database could be used to solve the navigation problem, and you didn't have to wait for GPS. And so Nolan, was excited by that, and he, during the time of the race, he offered to give me the seed money to start a company to do that. And so that's when initially Alan Phillips and Ken Milnes and I, left SRI and then founded a company that later became named ETAK, although the basis of that name is another story.
Yeah. In fact, you might tell us that, what ETAK means.
Yeah. Well, we didn't, in the beginning, when you start a company, all you really need is an office space and workbenches and oscilloscopes and,
I think I remember that.
Coffee machines and Xerox machines and stuff. You don't need a name. So we didn't name the company. And then at some point during the development, we gotten the map matching to work, we got the map display to work, and for probably in large part due to my own short-sightedness, the assumption was that maps needed to be north up, because all maps, by convention are north up. But one of the engineers, and my recollection was that it was J.B. Alagiani and George Lefmiller, two of those engineers, decided to try a map display where you rotated the map and you scrolled the map so that the car would always be in the center, and then the map would scroll and rotate as the car drove. And so the map would rotate to line up with outdoors. And I thought this was crazy. Maps have to be north up. But nevertheless, they, on a hunch, they coded it up. And even the folks that thought ahead of time that north up was going to be the way to go, like myself, within 20 seconds of driving in the car with a rotating map, were instantly converted. It became immediately apparent that the car-centered map that was rotating was the only way to go, because when you're driving, the visual clues to your orientation are so strong that a north-up map really doesn't work as well. And of course, when you're navigating a boat, you're at a nav station, it's very different. You don't have the visual clues to your orientation, so north-up is more familiar. But driving a car, it was instantly apparent that the car-centered rotating map display was critical. So astonishingly, we were able to patent that, and that became a very valuable patent through the years. But it was sometime after that when we were asked to come up with a name for the company. The lawyer said, we got to file some form and we need a name. And so at that point, I recalled a paper I'd written at Yale in an anthropology class. And given a lifelong interest in navigation, I wrote the paper on Micronesian and Polynesian navigation. And I remembered that there was a Micronesian cognitive mapping approach called ETAK, where the Micronesian navigators imagined their canoe in the center of the world. And then as you sail in directions, they imagined that islands move past you. And they say that in those days, if you showed a Micronesian navigator a chart of the South Pacific, they wouldn't be able to name the islands. But if you asked them to hold out their thumb and you told them what direction their thumb was moving, and you pulled the chart under their thumb, they could name the islands as they went by. And so it's a very different cognitive view of the world, where you're memorizing landmarks as you go rather than imagining the world as a spatial layout. But I remembered that approach, and that approach is called ETAK. And so we decided to name the company after it. And there's only many years later, there was two individuals that recognized the name. One was a guy named Ken Farmer at GM Research, who was a really good human factors guy. And he called me up at one point out of the blue and said, "Perfect name." And then another guy was Nainoa, who's the legendary Polynesian navigator that navigates the canoe Hokulea. And I got the chance to meet him many years later, and he was absolutely stunned that Howleys would not only know what the term ETAK meant, but would actually name a company after it. He was blown away to discover
did he read the newspapers to find out that the company had been founded? Or?
He was a young guy, so I think ETAK was gone, and I don't think he ever stumbled across it.
Oh, okay.
But when I met him, I told him the story because I went sailing on Hokulea for an overnight trip with him, and he was astonished that first that I would even know what ETAK meant, but secondly that to hear the story of navigation. And he was a very smart guy, so he really appreciated it. But that's where the name came. It was a sort of a Micronesian name.
Okay, there's one aspect of the Navigator that's really interesting, this business of the criticality of the maps. Now, you were working at the time with digital maps that weren't even in GPS coordinates. Is that correct? Was whatever the military?
We started with the Census Bureau dime file. And the dime file had the huge value that it had street names and address fields. But the Census Bureau, for reasons that are hard to understand from today's perspective, the Census Bureau hadn't maintained enough resolution in coordinates so that the maps, if you were to plot them, they were stored in latitude, longitude, but if you were to plot them, they looked, very rough. Because all the Census Bureau needed was a map to control the census, and so for a census data taker to be able to find, the right block face and to knock on the doors. So the Census Bureau did what they needed, which is they had the address ranges and the street names, but they only needed the rough coordinates, so that's all they kept. But for us, that wasn't sufficient. And so a large part of the early development of ETAK's database was to take the Census Bureau data, which had good address fields and street names and other boundaries associated with the two cells, like zip codes and city and park and water and other characteristics of a two-dimensional area. And then we would conflate that with the accurate coordinates that we were able to measure off of either aerial images or other image sources such as the USGS quad maps. And so then we would take those image sources, meaning the images of the quads or in many cases aerial imagery, and then we would overlay that on the data of the Census Bureau dime file, and then we would improve the coordinates. And the way we did it was actually a very interesting approach. Take the case of an aerial image from an aircraft. It's distorted. So what we would do is we would find a number of locations on that distorted image that we could recognize. Unambiguously, that's a certain intersection. We would compute the distortion of that image. And in those days, it was computationally impractical to take the distortion out of the image. So what we would do is we would measure the distortion of the image. We would display the image on a high-resolution screen, and then we would distort the vector database of the dime file with that same distortion, and then we would overlay it on the graphic image. And if the dime file were perfect, they would overlay perfectly. But in fact, the dime file didn't have the necessary coordinate accuracy, but nevertheless it would overlay in such a way that a user could very quickly go along and move the zero cells into place and to add new zero cells to pick up the curvature of a curved road. And so it was a very, very efficient way of improving the coordinate accuracy of the dime file. And then once the dime file correctly overlaid the image from the aerial image, we would then remove the distortion, and we would translate it back into latitudes and longitudes. And that was the technique that we used to digitize, to improve the coordinates of the digital map. And so we weren't doing it on a digitizing table. We were doing it in a very early graphic workstation.
But you wanted true distance on a flat map, fundamentally.
Well, it turns out, and this is another whole discussion almost, but it turns out that the world is this, oblate spheroid.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the ETAK Navigator, its calibration of its wheel sensors was accurate enough, given the fact that radial tires had been invented and they have all this steel and Kevlar that goes around the circumference of the tire, that it turns out that you could calibrate the wheel sensors accurately enough so that we needed to actually model the shape of the Earth as an oblate spheroid. And so we couldn't use a plane approximation for the map, and we couldn't even use a spherical approximation for the globe. We had to actually do the calculations properly, taking account of the fact that the Earth is an oblate spheroid.
The GPS coordinate system.
But for the very local calculations of, what road are we on, those would take place in sort of a local plane arithmetic, just because it's far more efficient for the 8088 we were using at the time to do those calculations, plane calculations. But nevertheless, we would distort that little postage stamp of a plane with our knowledge of the fact that that the Earth is actually an oblate spheroid. And similarly, we had to take the model for the magnetic fields, which is a reasonably complicated model around the world, and it changes with time. But we would have to, use that model to come up with what the variation was for each sort of the local postage stamp where the car is navigating in.
Yeah, and that's because you're using a magnetic compass to determine direction. Yeah.
Right. And the magnetic compass, you have variation, which of course changes depending on where you are. But then you have huge amounts of deviation that come about due to the car itself. And the car gets magnetized when you slam a door, and the car gets magnetized when you drive over a new bridge, and there's a very strong incident field. And so we were constantly learning the deviation of the car. And then there's the deviation of the car due to just the flux focusing due to the soft iron in the car. And so we have to learn that. So it was a very sophisticated self-calibration routine.
Yeah, that's remarkable, yeah. Okay, so you've got the map part of it down. Now the whole business then of finding an optimum route from point A to point B was that a...
That came quite a few years later. The initial navigator would show you where you were and keep track of where you were as you drove by measuring your distance.
Oh, and it just had a mark on the... Yeah.
And then it would remove accumulation of uncertainty and error by the cross-correlation. And then it would allow you to find a destination by putting in an intersection of two streets or a street and address, and it would show you the destination. But the initial navigator left the user on his own to zoom in and out and figure out how to get there. And for the most part, it worked pretty well, because if you zoomed out, you'd see the high priority roads, which are the ones to make sense to use to get into the vicinity. And then as you get closer, you'd zoom in and you'd see the arterials and the collectors, and then you'd find your way. But there was occasionally a problem that we called the Lothmiller's dilemma, named after George Lothmiller, who was one of the guys that joined us from SRI. And Lothmiller's dilemma was the situation where you could see where the destination was, but if you zoomed out far enough to see the destination, you couldn't see the roads. But if you zoomed in to see the roads, you couldn't see the destination. And so then the dilemma was, you just kind of have the confidence that you'll somehow figure it out as you get closer. And occasionally that would get you in trouble. And then later, especially after we did a license deal with Robert Bosch and Blaupunkt, that they were very interested in doing the routing. And so then Sia Kuznetsov was one of the ETAK engineers that led the initial development of the routing approach and came up with the feature that was part of the travel pilot, which was Blaupunkt's version of the Navigator, that would actually recommend the turns all the way to the destination. But what Sia did is she sensibly took advantage of the inherent prioritization of the map database to you sort of climb up the tree of priorities to get you into the vicinity, and then you climb down the trees of priorities to get all the way to the destination. And so by taking advantage of that prioritization that's inherent in the way we stored the database, Sia was able to come up with a navigation system that worked quite efficiently, even in the days when the map retrieval was quite slow.
That's fascinating. Okay, now there were several other things, I guess, that in the course of putting all that together, you had the display unit you had to deal with, and the making it rugged, the tape drives that you were using, the cassettes that stored all that information had to be redesigned, or is there some of the details of that?
Yeah, when we designed the Navigator, we'll take the display first. Memory was really expensive. So the first Navigator used an 8088 And the very first Navigator had 128 kilobytes of random access memory. And then the later version had 256. But memory was expensive. And so when we were sorting out the display, we didn't really want to pay for enough memory to do a bitmapped display. And then the other problem was that the display had to be viewable in direct sunlight. And in the day, we had to use a CRT. And if you had a bitmapped display on a CRT, the beam spent most of its time scanning the whole surface of the screen. And the beam actually wasn't turned on that much of the time. So the amount of photons you could create wasn't all that great. So it was a struggle to have the CRT be bright enough. And then if you tried to turn up the beam current too much, it would bloom. So that wasn't a solution. So what we discovered was we found a solution to both of those problems, and it was largely recommended by Al Alcorn and Nolan Bushnell. But they suggested that we consider a vector display. And anybody that's used oscilloscopes in the old day would understand exactly what I mean. But instead of having the CRT beam scan the whole surface of the screen, instead the CRT beam would spend almost all of its time turned on and would actually draw the roads on the map and would actually letter the street names. And oscilloscopes used to work in this way, where they'd put the labels on the top and the bottom by actually drawing them with the beam. But the beauty of that approach is that it didn't take much memory, because you didn't need a bitmapped display. And you could leave the beam on 95% of the time, because the beam's spending most of its time actually drawing. And so therefore it could be much, much brighter, because you just got a lot more photons that you could get coming off the phosphor without having a ridiculously high beam current. And so it was a really nice solution to both problems of having an inexpensive display and having a display that was extremely bright using affordable small CRTs in the day. And Alan Phillips and Jamie Buxton came up with a very clever kind of a charge pump running an integrator. So we were able to come up with the analog voltages to drive the beam around without even having an expensive D to A converter. So it was a very clever solution at the time. And then later, of course, everybody ended up with LCD displays and memory became cheap, so it all changed. And then similarly, there was a problem on the data storage that when we started ETAK, we kind of knew about CD-ROMs, and we knew that eventually that was going to be a good approach, but they were unavailable in a way that could store data and could survive the temperature and be affordable for the ETAK Navigator. So we had to do a tape drive. And the tape drives that you could buy were too expensive, and they couldn't survive in the temperature of a car. And cars get really hot when they're parked on asphalt, in a shopping center parking lot in Arizona in the middle of the day. It's incredible, the temperatures. So we had to build a tape drive that could survive the temperature of a parked car. And so the cassettes actually had to be made out of Lexan. And then we needed to move the tape very quickly, so we couldn't use a capstan drive. So we used a direct hub drive where you could move it very fast. We could read all 4 tracks at once. And so we had to come up with a complete custom digital tape data storage system, including our own tape drive, operating system and tape motion control and the whole deal, including problems of when somebody turns the car off, we had to move the tape so that the tape isn't sitting against the head. We had to move the tape to a place where there was a place for the head to rest, where it wouldn't wreck the tape. I mean, there's a bunch of issues that we had to address. And then that also, interestingly, forced us to do a very clever job of storing the map database, because the tape is fundamentally a linear medium, and a digital map is fundamentally, two-dimensional or three-dimensional if you look at priority. And so therefore, you can't avoid, long seeks. There's occasionally going to be some boundary where you drive across some boundary and you're going to have to move the tape a long way. But we could minimize the number of times that happened by trying to do a really efficient job of storing the map data on a tape. And Marv White led the development of a carrier structure, hierarchical approach of storing the map data, where we would use the inherent priority of the roads themselves to divide the database into regions, these sort of ever higher and higher priority 2 cells. And that technology that Marv developed or led the development of to store maps efficiently on tape was a big asset, a significantly valuable asset for ETAK for years to come, because even when you ran on mini computers and mainframes, ETAK software could access the map data much more quickly than conventional software because of this very sensible structure to the map data. So that was a very interesting approach and was the subject of a number of patents.
Yeah. So how many patents were actually spun out of ETAK on a rough number?
I would say about 30 total.
Yeah. Fascinating, yeah. And some of them never even made their way back into ETAK, was the gyroscope.
Yeah, there was a number, as with any company, if you aggressively write patents, mostly patents get used for barter, if anything, and a lot of patents by the time they issue are so narrow as to not be useful. But ETAK was in an interesting situation where we had 3 or 4 patents, and Walt Zavoli would be the expert because he really looked after the portfolio. But I think we had 3 or 4 patents that actually developed a significant amount of royalty income, not for the inventors, but for ETAK in the early stages and then the subsequent owners of ETAK and the patents later, which were News Corp and then Sony and then Tele Atlas and ultimately TomTom.
Okay. Oh yeah, TomTom. Yeah. So, okay. There's something you must have appreciated at the time. The GPS, was becoming more and more affordable. You must have anticipated there's a time where this whole operation is going to get absorbed with a totally different technology. Did you anticipate that, or did you see growing into it, or?
Yeah, we knew about the development of GPS, of course, and Brad Parkinson was part of our sort of larger family, given that we were from SRI and that Parkinson was at Stanford at the time. And so we certainly knew of the development of GPS, and I was a close friend of Charlie Trimble, dating back from sailing, where in the early days Charlie would lend me his various products, Lorancy and whatnot. And I stayed in close touch with Charlie to understand the evolution of affordable GPSs. And so we knew that GPS would have an effect, and we assumed that GPS would replace map matching, and that all the work we'd done to develop this map matching solution would be set aside, and then a GPS receiver would replace it. And we were absolutely wrong. And what happened instead was that when GPS came in, it solved a lot of problems, meaning it meant that the car could never get completely lost. And if the car was taken on a tow truck to a different part of the city, it would wake up and it would put itself in the vicinity. But the thing that we were interested in was that vehicle navigation systems that were primarily based on GPS still used map matching. And the reason was that if you used GPS alone, it would look sloppy to the driver, because the car would be wandering around and it wouldn't stay on the roads, and you'd turn a corner and the car would overshoot or undershoot, and it just looked messy. And so what all of the vehicle navigation companies did was they continued to use map matching. And they used map matching for the precise navigation, and they used GPS just to make sure the map matching didn't get completely off the rails. And so if the car got towed, or if the car went through a long tunnel, or for some reason there was a diverging road and the map matching made a mistake, the GPS would keep the car in the vicinity, but map matching would keep it exactly on the right roads and make it look perfect. And so, to our amazement, the map matching patent ended up one of the most valuable patents that the company ever developed. And the other one that was also amazed us was the rotating map patent. And today you can't imagine that somebody could patent the rotating map, but back then, it wasn't, this wasn't part of the popular culture. And we were all frankly surprised. Well, not like say I was surprised. I think there were guys with better insight like George Loftmiller and J.B. Alagiani who I may have known all along that we were going to end up with a rotating map because they had, an incredible insight into human factors. But nevertheless, the rotating map wasn't part of the popular culture. And so we were able to get a patent on that for the use of displaying data to drivers.
So where did it all go now? We've come through the sales of ETAK and so on, and then there's a transition coming.
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Okay, well, I guess now we've come to ETAK. ETAK was eventually sold, and companies evolved from it, so that the ETAK technology, I guess, what I was getting at earlier was the ETAK technology is going to give way to another system, the GPS-based system, and then what you're saying, I think, was the ETAK technology that went on, was the map matching and things of that sort.
Yeah, ETAK was sold in '89 to News Corp.
Yeah.
And Rupert Murdoc acquired it mostly because he was very, very farsighted, and he, I think, was already in '89 thinking about something like Google Maps and Google Earth. And he was already thinking that someday people would want to ask the question, where is the nearest and how do I get there, when they're doing classified ads or yellow pages. And so he acquired ETAK because of the digital map, because at the time in '89, ETAK had the highest quality digital map of the US and for a large chunk of Europe. Then News Corp got into a bit of a debt problem after a few years, and then Rupert asked me to stay on as head of technology for News Corp, but he asked me to sell ETAK. And so then I got promoted within News Corp ultimately to head of technology, and then I sold ETAK, and ETAK was bought by Sony. Sony was interested more in the consumer product for vehicle navigation. And then Sony eventually merged ETAK into an outfit called TeleAtlas. And then TeleAtlas was ultimately bought by TomTom. And when TeleAtlas was bought by TomTom, I think the size of that transaction was about $5 or $6 billion. So it was a significant transaction.
Now, TomTom had a Navigator at some point in the market, did they not?
Yeah, TomTom was in that
they
business.
Were a competitor?
And they acquired ETAK, and what they acquired, they acquired ETAK, but at that point it was part of TeleAtlas, and it was known as TeleAtlas. They acquired TeleAtlas, and I think the reason there was for the patent portfolio, but primarily for the map database and the mapping system and the mapping organization. But they did end up with a valuable patent portfolio, and then they've used that portfolio effectively since. Most of the patents, of course, have expired by now. Most of the original patents. There's a number of improvement-based patents. And then ETAK's, the technology that ETAK pioneered, I think the topological structure of the map database had originally been pioneered by Marv White and James Corbett and Don Cook and the guys like that at the Census Bureau. And then ETAK pioneered a way of making that very efficient with a sort of hierarchical carrier structure. And I think that has lived on, although it's less necessary now because the computers are so darn fast. The map matching has lived on, and the map matching is even done by our phones. When you're driving on a road, you'll notice, your car on your phone will wander about for a bit until the algorithm realizes that it's driving, and then it'll start map matching, and then it'll stay exactly on the road, and it all looks very precise. So map matching will live on, and I would imagine would live on until GPS gets to the point where it's sub-meter, maybe L5. But even then, I think map matching will probably live on to solve the problem of multipath and whatnot. Yeah. So I think map matching has just become pervasive. And then the rotating maps, of course, are pervasive. That everybody prefers that whenever you're outdoors, and the visual clues to orientation are so strong that it's hard to do it otherwise.
Okay, so we're at News Corp now, and concepts are being developed at News Corp that lead to your sports enhancement, or what's the trajectory there?
Well, when ETAK got acquired, I had been the CTO of ETAK since I founded it. Early on when we founded ETAK, I knew that I was an engineer but not a CEO. I didn't have any CEO experience, so I hired George Bremser to be the CEO. And George Bremser was just fabulous to work with. He became like kind of a godfather to a number of us. But George Bremser partially retired after a while, and although he stayed with ETAK, part-time for decades. But when we sold ETAK to News Corp, Rupert Murdoc asked me to run it as the CEO. And so I ran ETAK, and then as the CEO of ETAK, as a wholly owned operating subsidiary of News Corp, I was asked to attend all of the management conferences with all of the other CEOs. And of course, ETAK was this tiny little navigation and digital mapping company in Silicon Valley. And the other companies were companies like News International and HarperCollins and Fox, and significant media companies. But nevertheless, there I was giving my presentation every management conference. And the other CEOs got to know me, and they realized that I was an engineer who could explain stuff to them. So they could ask me questions that were timely in those days, like, what is encryption? And what is conditional access? And what's the internet? And what does Bill Gates want to talk to me about in this meeting in 2 weeks? And what is... and they started asking me to, attend meetings with them and support them, because they found that I understood this stuff, but I could also explain it to them. And that may be the benefit of engineering education at Yale, because you learn to speak and write and whatnot as well as the technical stuff. And so by the time News Corp got into its debt crisis and I was asked to sell ETAK, I was probably spending half my time on News Corp stuff, meaning going to meetings, with Rupert and with the other CEOs, helping advise them on technical issues. TV Guide was doing a complete upgrade of their, electronic publishing system, and they needed people that could, help them understand what the key questions were and so forth. And so Rupert Murdoc, somewhat before I was asked to sell ETAK, he asked me to hire somebody else to run ETAK and to be the VP technology for News Corp. So I became VP technology for News Corp. Going into that job, I had no idea what that meant, because I'd spent my entire career either working as an engineer or as the CEO of an entirely technical company. And so now I was the sort of staff VP technology of this $10 billion media company. And I discovered that it was a terrible job for me. I was absolutely ill-suited to it. I was being incredibly well paid. And Rupert Murdoc told me I was doing a good job, and everybody was glad to have my support. But I felt I was very unhappy because I didn't feel like I was doing anything. I wasn't building anything, and I wasn't working with engineers, and I felt like all I was doing is flying around to meetings and answering the phone. And so I was earning a ton, but very unhappy. And then it was during that period that I figured out that the only way to keep my head screwed on straight was to get back involved in building something. And I figured, well, I'm head of technology for this big company. I ought to be able to have a project on the side where I can at least feel as though I'm earning a living. So one thing that had happened during this period is that I got to know David Hill quite well. And he was founding Fox Sports at the time. And I got to know him through various creative projects that Rupert Murdoc asked us to work together on. But David asked me that whenever I was in LA to have lunch with him once a week and to brief him on something technical that could impact the televising of sports. And he just wanted to kind of keep his head, to have an aerial view of how technology could affect the broadcast of sports. And so we'd have a number of these lunches. And David was just a wonderful guy, is a wonderful guy to work with. And in fact, we're still close friends and talk every couple of months. But on one of these lunches, I explained to David that it was just barely technically possible, given the most powerful SGI computers you could buy And it's interesting, here we are in an SGI building, but it was just barely possible to compute simple computer graphics fast enough so that you could position them in an overlay on live video and position them correctly relative to the image of the real world in the live video so that they could appear to be in the real world. And the example I used to explain this to David was, for example, you could insert a billboard. And you could put a billboard someplace where it couldn't actually be, like on the grass or in the stands or something, or you could replace an existing billboard. And David said that that was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard, but if you could put something in the real world, his question was, could you do something useful? And I said, well, what do you have in mind? And he said, well, he'd just done the deal for hockey. Could you put a trail behind the hockey puck and show where the puck was? And I knew from my SRI background that we could track the puck. And I said, yeah, you could do that. It would be, you couldn't afford it, but nevertheless, it would be possible with the technology of today to both track and then put a trail behind the puck in live video. But it would be a sort of an SRI level of development for the tracking, and then it would require the most powerful SGI computers to do the computer graphic overlay. But yeah, it would be possible, but it's not affordable for TV. So David observed correctly in hindsight, as it turns out, that I probably didn't understand the economics of TV. So could I write him an email telling him what it would cost? So I went and talked to some of the guys and scratched my head and figured out, gave him a guess that it would cost $2 million. And this is in '94, so that's a lot of money. And it would take 2 years. And so I sent that email to David Hill, and in about 10 minutes, I got a phone call from Rupert Murdoc. And Rupert Murdoc says, David Hill tells me you could highlight the hockey puck for the All-Star game 2 years from now, for $2 million. And I said, yeah. And he said, do it.
That's beautiful.
And so at that point, what I did was I started the news technology group. And so I stole some of the key guys out of SRI and created a technology group. And we set up, here in Mountain View, in fact, very close to where we're talking now, just around the corner. And we set up a group to develop the Fox Tracks system that would track and highlight the hockey puck. And we started work in '94. Rick Cavallero was absolutely central to that development. And a number of the other, SRI colleagues worked on it. The guys at Vista, Phil and Hal and those guys. Phil
Alan
Evans.
Burns,
And,
yeah.
Pardon me?
Alan Burns.
Alan Burns was a key guy. Hal Goodart and Phil Evans. And Terry O'Brien did the mechanical engineering. And then Tim Heidman and Wade and J.R. Glaudemans were the key guys on the software side. And they had a company called Shoreline Studios that was right near here. But in any event, we started in '94. And
but you said something caught my attention, that you knew you could track the hockey puck. How did you intend to do it at that time?
At the time, we figured we would try 3 different approaches, and we would see which one came easiest. And, as you know, that's how we've done a lot of things at SRI. When you're trying to do something that hasn't been done, you kind of play your hunches, and you try a couple of things and take advantage of the fact that some things very quickly it becomes apparent that they're more difficult than you thought, and other things, sometimes you get lucky and they continue to look practical. And so we started a couple of different initiatives in parallel. One initiative we came up with was to do a FMCW radar transponder in the puck. We worked with Judd Heinzman on that. We did get it to work. The problem was that the pucks were expensive. And at a hockey game, in those days, the nets didn't extend up, and the pucks would go into the stands, and you could never get a puck back from the stands. And so you'd go through 30 pucks a game, and it was becoming clear that it was going to be an expensive operating cost to have to lose 30 pucks a game with the FMCW transponder, or the radar transponder.
It was a transponder you actually put in there.
Yeah, so it was a full-off radar. So we would transmit, and then we would measure the response. and we had to range gate because indoor stadiums ring like a bell. Yeah. So you'd have to range gate to not listen to the reflections, but we got it to work. But the cost was a wrinkle. Another approach we looked at early on, but set aside very early on, was a retro-reflecting puck. And the problem was the surface of the puck is really important to the game, and you really can't change a lot of the properties of that rubber because the way the puck behaves. So that was one that we were able to set aside very quickly. And then the approach that we ultimately used, because the puck was cheap, was to have a puck where we embedded in the puck a lithium battery and accelerometer so the puck could figure out when it was in play, a ceramic oscillator, and then we had infrared emitters all around the puck on the edges and the top and bottom, and then they would emit 100 microsecond pulses of infrared 30 times a second. And then Phil Evans built a system that would synchronize to the puck, so we knew when the puck was pulsing. And then we had image sensors around the arena that were cameras, but they had cavity interference filters in front of them, so they were only sensitive to the very narrow spectrum of the infrared emitters. And then the shutters were synchronized to the puck, so the shutter was only open during the 100 microseconds that the puck was pulsing. So because the camera was only sensitive to that spectrum and at that time slot, we had huge clutter to noise. And so it was really easy to track the puck, given that we cheated and the puck was emitting infrared. But you couldn't do it due to image processing alone, because a hockey rink is a complicated place. And there's too many things that are black and 3 inches across, like sticks and elbows and ankles and forearms and skates, and there's just lots of stuff that's black and 3 inches in a dimension.
Now, do I remember right that the tracking the puck was actually done with metric stereo? We had 2 cameras. Did you?
No, we had six to 9, but in many cases 6 cameras around the rink in different locations. Above it,
each camera was a pair?
Each camera was just by itself.
It was a single camera, yeah.
Yeah. We looked at an approach, and we tested an approach where we would do frame differencing. We'd take 200 microsecond exposures, one after the other, one during the pulse of the puck and one not during the pulse of the puck, and we'd subtract the two to subtract out any CW infrared sources that would appear in both images, whereas the puck would only appear in one. And that approach was hugely effective, but we didn't need it, because just the combination of the cavity interference filter and then the opening the shutter just during that 100 microseconds, that all of the other sources of CW infrared would be driven down by many tens of dB, because they were broad spectrum sources like a match or an incandescent light, and they were CW sources. And so the puck was able to outcompete them effectively. But the system could not run in an arena that was lit with incandescent lights, because then there was just too much infrared. The background was just too bright. And fortunately, energy was getting expensive, and all of the hockey rinks were upgrading
to solved your problem.
Much more sensible lights. And so I think there was only one time we had to deal with a rink that had incandescent lights, and they were delighted to upgrade, because it was long since past time when they should have done that anyway. Plus, incandescent lights for a hockey rink are inefficient not only because they use a lot of energy, but then they need the refrigeration system for the ice to remove the energy. So it was really a bad idea for a rink, and so the timing was great for us.
That's good. So the whole part of that problem, you got the detection problem solved. Now the business of actually calculating where that puck is and getting that information into the video stream wasn't exactly a back of the envelope competition.
It's a funny thing, but that's a part of the project, and I think you would appreciate that because we have the same background from SRI, but that was a part of the project that we all kind of thought of as being the straightforward part. Yeah. That it's all just it's all just geometry.
Yeah, it's just calculations.
So you figure out where the puck is because you have, 6 cameras, and every time they open their shutters, they all measure an angle, and then you compute where it is, and you do standard calculation to figure out the most probable position, given that they don't all cross at a point. And then given you know where the puck is, you know where the broadcast cameras are. You measure their pan, their tilt, their zoom, their focus. You measure the distortion of the lens as a function of zoom and focus. And then for every field of video, you compute where the puck would appear in every field of video from each of the cameras. And now that's, of course, done in augmented reality. And we all kind of thought of that as work. And there's a lot of coordinate transformations, and there's a lot of mathematics. But we never saw that as being a real risky part of the project. It was just you got to
just do it.
You got to get all the math right. And it's a great example even for kids today of the importance and the usefulness of mathematics. Because, kids will look at the yellow first down line and say, cool. And you say, see? That's why it's important to know math.
It was always interesting that sometimes you could see the puck behind a barrier.
Yeah, we didn't key it. So in those days, the overlays were on top of everything.
Yeah,
and so then, but the trick was to get it done in time, because they don't stop hockey games in order for the graphics to catch up. You have 60 fields of video, and they're roaring along. And as each field of video comes along, you can delay it a second or so if you have to, but you have to keep up in real time, meaning you need to emit 60 fields of video with a graphic on top. So we would take all of our measurements, we would delay the video. In the early days of the puck, we delayed it for 2 seconds. We'd have to get all of our calculations done in time, then we'd have to tee up this graphic overlay and have it sitting there ready to get slapped on top of the output video field that was 2 seconds delayed. And then the timing had to be perfect. Meaning, when we measured the pan and tilt and zoom and focus of the camera, we had to get the camera at the exact instant that shutter was open, so that when the cameraman is panning and tilting very quickly, the graphic stays, exactly on the puck, which would be most important if the puck were stationary. Otherwise, you'd see the blue highlight, wiggle around. So there's a whole lot of things we had to get right in order for the effect to work. And in a lot of ways, I think I underestimated the significance of the development of AR. And if I'd been a better businessman, I think what I would have done at the time when we developed the puck is I would have started a company and called it, Augmented Reality Incorporated, and said, we're in the business of augmented reality in all fields. But at the time, I thought that augmented reality was easy. That's just mathematics. The hard part was, the tracking and the sensors and the real world in terms of...
wasn't there even an issue with the fact that the union rules said that the operation of the cameras had to be done by union people, and they had to calibrate the Rino and all of those issues?
It's a really good question. The integration with the broadcast TV compound was critically important. And none of us that had been at ETAK and SRI, and none of the technical development group knew anything about the field TV production. And then the field TV production, they have a culture as strong as offshore racing. They have their own terminology, they have their own culture. And they don't like guys showing up with lab coats and telling them what to do. That wasn't going to work at all. And I knew that. I knew enough about TV production, having worked at News Corp as head of technology, to tell David, look, I can track the puck and I can compute overlays, but there's no way I could figure out how to integrate this into a field TV production compound. And David introduced me to Jerry Gepner, who later became one of the co-founders with me of Sportvision. Jerry Gepner, myself, and Bill Squadron on the business side. And Jerry Gepner was the head of field operations for Fox Sports. And he had a wonderful breadth of interest in that he was a legend in TV field operations. Everybody in the business knew Jerry. But he was also a guy who was really interested in technology and open-minded to technology. And so he was delighted to be involved in the development of the puck. And then later, of course, he was one of the co-founders of Sportvision. And he was the one who helped us through many, many cultural and technical issues that would have caused us to fail, associated with the integration into the technology and the culture of a TV operation. And part of that was that, you know, these cameramen are super highly skilled union people. You can't mess with them. You can't get in their way. And you can't even make their job the slightest bit harder. And then if we're going to put instruments on the head, the pan tilt head, well, you can't replace, you know, it has to be this kind of head, you know, a Vinton head, because that's the best in the industry, and they won't work with anything else. And then similarly, when we take the video, and we had to delay the video, and then we had to key our graphic overlay on top, and then we had to re-emit that video. He said, you know, in our truck, nobody's going to care what we use for computers, nobody's going to care about any of that other stuff, but these TV engineers are going to come into our truck and they're going to look at that video path, because that's their product that's going through our truck. And if we're going to run that video through systems, it has to be this equipment. You know, we need to buy this delay line, we need to buy this keyer. And if they come in and they see that brand name, they'll say, okay, you guys get it. And if they see any other brand name, you know, they won't accept it.
Were they concerned at all about what it was doing, or just the brand name?
Well, different levels. I mean,
Yeah.
the storytellers and the producers and directors are interested in the creative part and how to tell a story and what the effects are. But the TV field production people are interested in the quality of the signal. And the signal content will be whatever the producer and director and TD want. But they want to be sure that their signal doesn't go to black and their signal isn't distorted and their timing doesn't jitter. And they want to see, because they do a first-class job, they want to see that their signal is only going through the absolute best electronic path.
Okay, that's the motivation
And then
for it.
Jerry briefed us, you know, on the terminology, on what to wear, on who to talk to, who not to talk to, on, you know, just how to not appear like you're an engineer at a broadcast event, you know, how to appear you're part of the field crew. And, you know, the culture all the way up to, you know, nobody leaves before the compound is completely struck at the end of the game. So when we finally showed up at sporting events, you know, we were accepted as people who got it. But that was only because, you know, Jerry had trained us to get it. But it was an absolutely critical part that we knew we needed that help, and then we were able to find a guy like Jerry who was interested and willing to help us figure it all out. And then Jerry, you know, as a way of housing the puck system, Jerry knew that we needed to have a TV truck that would look like a TV truck. So he bought an old CBS TV truck that was called the puck truck. And it was a truck that all these people in the industry knew. And then we gutted it and we put in all of our kit in it. And then, you know, that puck truck had the right power system, and the puck truck, if you open up the side panel and you look at the interconnect, it had all the right connectors. And I mean, we interfaced to a production TV compound as if we knew what we were doing. And we did in that respect because of Jerry. But it was absolutely critical. And then Jerry did one other thing that was astonishing, which was our first game was supposed to be at the All-Star game in '96. And that was Fox's very first hockey game to air. But of course, we needed to test the system. And so Jerry was able to convince the broadcaster that was carrying hockey at the time to let us show up with our truck, to put our heads under their cameras, and to let us operate the puck highlighting system. Not to air, but to let us operate it, you know, in the background to test it. And we were doing this in a broadcast compound that was working for a competitor to Fox. And we were actually putting heads under their cameras. And the only reason they let us into the compound, provided power to our truck, provided us the video feeds, let us put our heads under their cameras, was the fact that, just like offshore sailing, it's a small world. And everybody in that compound figured that sooner or later they'd be working for Jerry again. And so when Jerry asked for a favor, they figured he'd be a good guy to owe them a favor someday. And so they were willing to help. But that was something that not in a million years could we have done without a guy like Jerry being involved.
Okay, so the hockey puck is working. You had your big debut. I guess you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was hairy. it's a big system, with a lot of moving parts and a lot of telemetry around the stadium, cameras and pulse detectors all over the stadium, with running wires to all of them. And I think the last problem we had was from time to time, our telemetry would get really noisy and we'd start getting very flaky telemetry. And when the telemetry was good, the system would work solidly, but every now and then the telemetry would just go bad. And we were struggling off and on with this problem right up until probably a half an hour before the All-Star game. It was just, and at one point the guys were asking me, should we call it off? Should we tell David? And I said, no, not until the end. We got to keep trying to find this damn thing. And we did find it, and it was just shortly before the game. But what it was is we had a really bad dimmer on the lights in our production truck. And this dimmer was creating, it was like a leaf blower on the power line. And what would happen was whenever we were trying to debug, people would turn the lights up so we could see what we were doing. But whenever we went into operating mode, they'd turn the lights down so that the operators could see the screens better. And then this noise would come in. And then finally, we correlated it. That's this goddamn dimmer. And then, of course, we fixed that instantly, and then that problem went away. But that's just sort of a characteristic of, it's just always something.
Yeah, the last minute.
But it was pretty hairy for a while. But it did work at the very first game. So when Rupert and David Hill said, "Can you get it working by the All-Star game?" we did, and it was 2.2 million instead of the 2 million we'd estimated.
That's not bad.
And it was on schedule, and it worked, and it was frightening. And then it became less frightening with time as we continued to make improvements and making things more robust. And then that stayed on air for the A game at Fox, meaning Fox's most important weekly hockey game for the rest of the time Fox had the contract with the NHL. But Fox branded it very strongly, Fox Tracks. And so when ESPN took over the contract, they didn't use it.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
it has been used a few times since. But once HD TV came in, it became, I know that hockey fans say you don't need to see the puck.
Yeah.
You watch the game. But nevertheless, once HD TV came in, it became possible to see the puck. Because the way the compression works, the puck becomes very, very visible because it's very high contrast. And so it's only been used a few times since '98.
Okay, so we go from there to Sportvision.
Yeah, so at that point I was having a wonderful time working with the technical group and the news technology group, and I was still doing the other part of my job at News Corp, but at least I was feeling sane because I could build stuff. And so I had my heart set on doing the yellow first down line with the news technology group. And at that point, as you can imagine, the first down line is different than the puck, meaning you have to key it around the players, and the football fields aren't flat, they're crowned, and so there's a different set of problems. But we'd sort of proven our ability to do augmented reality, and so we thought it was a pretty approachable problem if we could get the keying solved. And J.R. Glaudemans was hot on the trail of getting the keying solved. So I wanted to do the yellow first down line, and we had prototyped it. But I caught News Corp at a bad time, and News Corp was again as part of their sort of second debt crisis. And David Hill and Rupert Murdoc didn't want to field it right away. They wanted to go slow for a year and maybe field it in a year or two. And so I went, so Bill Squadron and Jerry Gepner and I made a proposal to Rupert Murdoc that we spin the news technology group off and start a new company. But to do that, the new company would need the patents and we would need the equipment. And so we did an incredibly far-sighted and fair deal with Rupert Murdoc, where he really was super fair to us. But he gave us the puck truck and all the equipment, the office space, the furniture, the test gear, all the employees I wanted, the rights under the patents, the exclusive perpetual rights for the life of the patents, in exchange for which he kept 10% of the equity in the new company. but because he was in a debt problem, he couldn't help us with any operating capital. And then at the time, I was navigating for Roy Disney on Pyewacket. And at the time, Bill Squadron was good friends with Fred Wilpon from the Mets. And so we raised a round of sort of friends and family venture capital to give us the operating cash that was largely funded by a few VCs and Fred Wilpon and Roy Disney. And then with that money, we took the puck truck and then extended and modified it to do the first down line.
And it was the same, the same
truck.
operation, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
the
you had
same
all
computers.
the hooks then, yeah.
The software was quite a bit different. And then we introduced the yellow first down line for Jed Drake at ESPN. And it came in the early part of 1998. And the puck had always been controversial. It developed very high ratings for Fox because people watched hockey who normally hadn't because they could watch the puck. But nevertheless, the diehard fans hated it. Whereas the yellow first down line, everybody loved it. I don't think there was a single criticism of it. And part of it may have been the fact that we keyed it around the players. So it just wasn't possible to argue that it got in the way or that it was distracting because it was stationary. It didn't move. It was stationary on the grass. It was keyed around the players. It was underneath everything. And yet it did something that we discovered in hindsight was really important in all of these systems, that for a system to work, it has to take something that's important to a game and hard to see and make it easy to see. And the first down line was a great example of that because it's the objective of almost every play to get to that line. And yet, once the camera zoomed in and you can't see the chain gang on the side, you can't see the objective of the play. But with the first down line, you could. And so it was hugely well received. And that we introduced in 98. And then Jed Drake also did a very interesting thing with the introduction, which is he didn't pre-announce it. He tortured us by bringing us to every game and having us operate the system, and he would look at it and he would say, well, I'd like the color different and it a little bit wiggled too much here and you got to make it so it doesn't wiggle and I need the edges softer. And every week we'd go back and we'd make improvements and come back. And he didn't know when he was going to introduce it because he wasn't sure when we would get it good enough. And so he didn't announce it. And then one game, I think it was in Baltimore in October, I think, but halfway through the game, he just calls the production truck and says, take it to air. And so it just went to air.
So nobody expected it.
And the phone started ringing and all the journalists are saying, how the heck do they do that? And everybody knew what it was.
Yeah.
But nobody could figure out how it was done.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And today, nobody cares. Everybody assumes that with a computer you can do anything. But in those days, people still thought about how stuff worked.
As I said, it was miraculously didn't obscure the players.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so people were calling up saying, is it on the grass? Or are they laying it out with chalk and vacuuming it up? Or,
yeah.
And if they do it electronically, how does it not go over the players? And there was this huge hubbub of discussion trying to figure out how it was done. But it is an interesting sign of how times have changed because now everybody expects that everything is easily doable with computers, and they don't try to make sense of it to see how it would work. But in those days, people really did want to understand how it worked. So it collected a ton of interest.
So with that success, then you take on something like baseball?
Well, so then we had it was so well received that we had a major project in our hands to make it affordable without a production truck and 10 people for the next season. So we had to develop whole new camera sensors that could be, we didn't have to run wires to every camera, that we could just take the data down the triax that's a part of every stadium. And then we couldn't have the amount of equipment, so we had to move to more affordable computers. So we had a major development effort before the next season to have remote camera sensors that the data would come down the triax, and to have affordable sets of computers that could fit in normal production trucks. And so we had to get that all done by the next season so that the next season we could roll out to do more and more games. And so that was a huge project to get it to where it was economically possible to do it. And of course now, or within a year or two, it grew to where it was done on every televised game, both NFL and NCAA. And so that was its own problem for us, is to get it affordable to scale up that quickly. And then after that, also for Jed Drake, we did the K-Zone, where we would track the baseball and then show the strike zone. And that system could operate live, but they mostly used it in replay, although now you occasionally see it in use live. And then we did...
How were you tracking the baseball?
The baseball, we didn't... The problem with hockey, I'm regressing a bit, but the problem with hockey was that the field of play is so complicated. All these sticks and ankles and elbows. In baseball, if you have high cameras, the background for the baseball is this absolutely stationary field of grass. So we didn't need to cheat. We didn't need to put something in the baseball. What we could do is we could take just images of the baseball from cameras at high home and high third or high
first. Done optically, yeah.
And then we could track it optically. And then the trick there was just the simple motion detection approach of frame differencing.
Frame differencing, yeah.
That you just subtract adjacent frames from one another. And then once you do the subtraction, everything that's not moving subtracts out and turns to black. And then, of course, the ball, leaps out at you. In fact, you have two balls, where it was and where it now is. And so we could measure the ball very accurately, 60 times a second, from about a meter after the pitcher let go of it to just before the plate. And then we would extrapolate it. By then we understood its dynamics, and then we would extrapolate it to the plane of that's defined by the major league rules, that's at the pitcher edge of the plate. And so that system worked really well.
Did it bother the umpires?
Say again?
Did it bother the umpires?
The umpires were opposed to it, violently opposed to it, until about 2 weeks after it was introduced. And then the umpires became big advocates. Because the system, as soon as it was fielded, it revealed something that nobody had expected, which is the officials do a much, much better job than anybody had imagined. And most of the cameras from the outfield weren't centered up right over the pitcher. So there was a little bit of distortion. And the umpires, as soon as the K-Zone was operating, people realized what an astonishingly good job the officials are actually doing. And so then the officials went from being, our enemy until 2 weeks after it was introduced to being our biggest advocates. And in fact, the officials asked that the sensors be installed at every ballpark, even when the K-Zone isn't used by the broadcaster.
Just to calibrate the umpires.
Because they wanted to understand how well their umpires are, they wanted to sort of do their own quality control. So that was fascinating. And then Major League Baseball, we asked them the question, and others have asked the question of, gee, you know exactly where the ball is. Will you ever use this instead of the official? And Major League Baseball had a really insightful answer to that, which is, no, today, it's too strong a culture of the game, this three-way battle between the official, the batter, and the pitcher. And yeah, the official's not always right, but he's always right, according to the rules. And it's this three-way battle, and the batter knows how the official calls it, the pitcher knows, and and it's just a fascinating part of the game that they don't want to change. So this is just a system to allow the viewer see. But then the Major League Baseball also said that they're aware that as the decades go by, they're going to have to change, because there will come a time when some future fan isn't willing to accept that a mistake had such a big effect on a game, given the fact that the data was right there. So they say that sometimes they will have to gradually address the fact that the fans are changing, and there'll come a time when the new fans are less tolerant of that culture.
Who is it that does the tennis in and out judgment? That when the ball's a millimeter off
That's one of the first systems where the measurements are actually used for the official call. LiveLine that we did for sailing, the measurements were used for the official calls.
But who did it? That wasn't Fox Tracks, was it?
Or
Sportsvision.
It wasn't originally innovated by Sportvision. Sportvision does now have a competitive system in tennis. Actually, Sportvision is now SMT. It was bought by SMT. But SMT is now in that business. But Sportvision wasn't the first to innovate that. I think it was first introduced by Hawkeye.
Okay, yeah.
But it is interesting that sports are starting to more incorporate, data, and certainly sailing incorporated it in the electronic umpiring and OCS and whatnot in the America's Cup.
So what other things are they looking at that might be enhanced? What about golf? I mean, is there any interest in tracking a golf ball to see where it's?
Well, there's quite a bit that's been done in golf, and Ken Mellons, our colleague, has led a lot of those projects at Sportvision and then SMT to both track the ball and highlight the ball, and they even do augmented reality from shoulder cams on cameramen that are in the golf area to show,
put them all together,
to show the fairway and the green and whatnot. So there's quite a bit that's been done in golf.
So, okay, so we've come through now. What was your transitions now from Sportsvision? Are you still a?
Well, we did it. We did the
what's the
NASCAR
status
system.
of Sportsvision right now? It's
We did NASCAR, and that was a project.
Oh, yeah, I forgot
was
about
led
that.
by
Sure, yeah.
Ken Mellons was the chief engineer on that. And that, it obviously depended on the augmented reality, but we had to do GPS tracking to RTK precision, meaning 2 centimeter precision. And in the day when we started that, RTK, carrier phase tracking, was common for surveyors and sort of high precision uses of GPS, but you'd set up an antenna on a tripod and you'd back away for 20 minutes and then you'd have a 2 centimeter position. And our challenge was to try to get a 2 centimeter position on 43 race cars that are going 200 miles an hour under a metal fence, so they could only see half the sky at any one instant, and then the half the sky they could see changed every minute as they went around. So it was a huge challenge, and we got it to work, and Ken was absolutely critical as the chief engineer for it. But we got it to work by cheating, and what we did was we closely coupled the GPS with an inertial navigation system. And so even when the car went under an overpass or the car temporarily lost the satellites, the car would know where it was within a couple of centimeters as it reacquired the satellites, and it wouldn't have to go through the whole computational process of figuring out what are the ambiguous possible solutions. It could immediately track the actual
So you were
solution.
using commercial GPS receivers?
Yeah, we
Those
were
not
coordinating. We
modified?
were working very closely with Novatel, and Pat Fenton and Tom Ford were critical engineers in this. But we were working with Novatel to get to closely couple the GPS with the INS, and then we also cheated by, we would survey the ribbon of track that's sort of suspended in 3 space.
Okay.
And we
yeah,
would
I know
only
exactly
consider
where it was.
those of the ambiguous solutions that were on that ribbon. And so when you normally do an RTK lock-in, you basically, the satellites are all moving pretty quickly. So there's a bunch of ambiguous possible solutions, but with time, they drift out, and then the ambiguous solutions become clearly crazy. But we didn't have a lot of time, and you're constantly losing lock as you go under underpasses. And if you just took an off-the-shelf RTK receiver that would be used by surveyors and you put it on a 200-mile-an-hour race car driving under a fence, it wouldn't even lock in. In fact, if you took a consumer GPS, your Garmin, and put it on a race car, it would never lock in. And so we had to find a way to maintain RTK, centimeter lock at 200 miles an hour under this fence. And Novatel was critical to it, but by the combination of surveying the track, so we could only consider those solutions, and closely coupling with an inertial navigation system, and the close coupling between a GPS and an INS is one of those marriages made in heaven, because both sides gain. Meaning when the GPS is in lock, you're able to remove all of the biases and offsets from the inertial navigation system. And then when the GPS loses lock, you have this extraordinarily accurate INS because it's been calibrated up to a fraction of a second ago. And you're only needing to dead reckon using that INS, for a second or two to get underneath some overpass. And so then when you come out from under that overpass, you have your position, nearly as accurately as when you went in. And so it's one of those beautiful marriages, that close coupling.
Yeah, in fact, I think there's a notion that at some point inertial navigation will replace GPS, but using them together seems to be the future.
Yeah, that was a fascinating argument between the MIT inertial group and the Brad Parkinson's GPS group. And of course, Brad sat right on the fence between them because he was from the MIT inertial group, and then he became the program leader of GPS. And I think it was one of his huge contributions to society was sort of mending that fence and making it clear to everybody that both technologies had something to gain. But INS, at the end of the day, no matter how good it is, you're going to have some accumulation of uncertainty and error. And GPS is getting better and better now, but in the past, you've always had this sort of random walk of error and uncertainty. And so the marriage of the two works really well.
Yeah, this is really a beautiful connection because we are starting in the museum to pick up some of the layers of GPS, and I think starting with this development is a really nice point to jump off, because every single one of the things you said are all related.
Well, get Charlie Trimble in.
Yeah, I'd very much like to do that. Yeah.
In fact, I still see Charlie 3-4 times a year. We serve on a board of directors together at KVH. And I discovered that I still had one of the original Trimble Transpacs, which was the sort of Desert Storm GPS receiver, in the garage. And so just a few weeks ago, I gave that to Charlie, and he was delighted to have one.
That's nice. Okay, so we've come all the way now through, let's say, we were finishing up with Sportvision. What's going on in Sportvision right now?
Well, Sportvision, I left in 2004. I got the opportunity to navigate the Volvo Ocean Race. And during this whole time, from the founding of ETAK to 2004, I had a kind of full-time job at ETAK, News Corp, Sportvision. But during that same time, I was also navigating professionally part-time. And so I was navigating for guys like Larry Ellison and Sayonara and Richard Branson on Virgin Money, navigated for Steve Fawcett on PlayStation, obviously Roy Disney.
But you always race monohulls?
No, in those cases, PlayStation was a 125-foot catamaran. And then so Larry Ellison, Roy Disney, Steve Fawcett, Richard Branson. So I was, the paid navigator for these projects, but I was just doing it part-time. So I would arrange my time in advance and, take off the time and do the preparation. And I got quite good at it and was, had good luck. And then in 2004, there'd been a number of times through that period that I'd been asked to navigate a Volvo Ocean Race. And the Volvo is the pinnacle event in professional sailing. And I'd always had to say no, because when I got these opportunities, they always fell at a time where I just started a company or just raised a round of venture capital or just committed to a major project, and I couldn't take off full time. And so then in 2004, the timing was perfect. Mike Sanderson asked me to navigate ABN AMRO in the 2005-06 Volvo Ocean Race. And I was then like 48, and I knew that this would probably be the last time I ever got asked, because I'd be the oldest guy in the fleet. And it was a good time to leave Sportvision. So I left Sportvision and then became a full-time professional sailor. And so at that point, I navigated the Volvo Ocean Race in 2005 and 6, which is kind of like joining the Army. You're away from home for 18 months. And we won, so that was huge. And then after that, I joined Team Origin, America's Cup team, as their navigator and performance director. The America's Cup, that was AC 33, that got tied up in a bunch of legal battles, and so Team Origin ended up pulling out. And then after that, I was asked by the French to navigate an attempt to set the round-the-world nonstop record. So I navigated for Franck Camas on Groupama 3 in 2010, and we set the round-the-world nonstop sailing record from France to France around the Great Capes in the Southern Ocean in 48 days.
I see, to bring technology back into it a little bit, am I correct in saying that you really mastered the art of collecting all of the weather information you can get your hands on, make projections of what the conditions are going to be for the race, and then maybe literally use that to give you the boost to surf a gale across the ocean or something like that?
Yeah, that's broadly what I do, and that's what my competitive navigators do also. And then where we compete is on the precision with which we can characterize the performance of our own boat in different wind angles and wind speeds and sea states. And then we also compete in our ability to characterize the strengths and weaknesses and characteristic errors of the different weather models. And so there's a lot of risk assessment, and there's a lot of trying to compute the optimum course in a situation where you're basing your calculations on data that's decreasingly dependable with time. And so there's a lot of judgment that you have to bring to bear. And there will come a time when machine learning and AI is able to do a lot of that better than it does now. But right now, given the relatively small market, the difficult parts are still require human judgment, meaning you do the best you can at analyzing the performance of your own boat. You do the best you can at making sure you have the best weather models. You compute the various optimum courses, but then you have to decide between them based on where your competitors are, based on the characteristic mistakes that you think might be in those models. And then you have to run experiments. Speed up a model, slow down a model, start earlier, start later, force it to go this way, force it to go that way, until you understand where the likely pitfalls are. And it's a funny thing that I've navigated for a lot of these guys I've mentioned, like Richard Branson and Steve Fawcett and Roy Disney and Larry Ellison, and they're all businessmen. And when they see what I do, they sort of all uniformly observe it's exactly what they do, meaning they're forced to make decisions based on information that's decreasingly dependable with time into the future. And my decisions, my currency is miles. That we all know the fastest course is a great circle. So you could always just sail the great circle and you've sailed minimum miles. Well, instead you sail a different course. You sail a longer course because you have an expectation you're going to get there faster. So what you're doing is you're investing an extra mile with the expectation that you're going to be repaid by more than the time it took to sail that extra mile. And so my currency is miles, and the decision I'm making is where to invest these extra miles with the expectation of getting to the finish quicker. And when they look at that problem, they say, wow, this is exactly what I do. And then I found that if I've got one of those guys sitting next to me at the nav station, which I often do, these guys are really smart, and they're very good decision makers, and they have very good intuition. I will frame my problem in their terms, saying, here's the deal. Here's where we are. Here's where the competitors are. This is the Great Circle course, the minimum miles. Now, this model, which is very good in this pattern, indicates that if we sail these extra 27 miles, we're going to get to the finish, so many minutes quicker. But if this model is wrong, we'll leave this competitor off to this other side, and what he's probably looking at is this other model, which I don't think is as good. And then you get to all of the sort of risk assessment decisions, like if you have a big lead, do you want to invest all of that lead to have 100% certainty of beating the next guy? If you could throw away your 20-mile lead and have 100% certainty of beating him by a meter, should you do so? And there's fascinating questions that come up, but all of these business guys are really good at that kind
this
of...
teeny little delta about whether you're putting up a spinnaker as quickly as you can does come into the equation.
Oh, certainly, and you would never give it all the way away to a meter because you need to keep, I'm just using that as an example.
I understand.
But nevertheless, if you have a 20-mile lead, you probably, and all you're trying to do is be first to finish, you probably are willing to invest a good chunk of that in order to almost eliminate the possibility that the next guy could find a way around you. Mm-hmm. But that's the sort of decision that, that's what I do, and these guys have really good instincts on that.
Yeah, so it's absolutely fascinating. So we have augmented reality and now sophisticated decision making.
Well, decision making in the presence of data that's decreasingly good with time, and of course, generals are good and admirals are good at that too. That's what they do. They have some information, and they don't know what the other guy's doing. But the hardest guy to compete with is somebody that he's doing something.
So, tell us a little bit about the augmentation of sailboat viewing. That was to watch a sailboat race, when all the boats are going every direction, you have no idea who's in the lead. Well,
that was it came out of a funny sequence of events. But I navigated for Larry Ellison in '95 on Sayonara, and I navigated in the Transpac and some other events. And I got to know Larry because at the time I was head of technology for News Corp. And Larry, Oracle was a vendor to News Corp, providing the Oracle database for 20th Century Fox and other things. And Larry Ellison and Rupert Murdoc were friends. And in fact, Rupert Murdoc had sailed with Larry on Sayonara in one of the Hobart races. And so Larry and I, knew one another pretty well, and I'm navigating on Sayonara. And he was aware of what I was doing at the time in the hockey puck and in the development of the yellow first down line. The first down line hadn't been introduced, but I described to him, what we were doing. And Larry asked me, well, what would you do for sailing? This is in '95, and I mentioned to Larry, well, in sailing would benefit more than almost any sport, because in sailing, there's lots and lots of stuff that's important to the event, but is hard to see, like who's ahead and who's behind and what wind direction is and what the current is and where the ley lines and where are the marks. And so what you do is you'd get a helicopter image and you'd put in ladder lines so you can see who's ahead, and you put in ley lines and you'd put in mark circles so you know when the rules change. And so I described that all in '95, but I also said, this is expensive stuff and the sport of sailing probably can't afford it. So then in 2010, I had just finished the round the world record on Groupama 3. Actually, it was during the round the world record on Groupama 3 that Fortune magazine, Larry won the America's Cup, and Fortune magazine interviewed Larry, and they said, so you won the America's Cup, you're going to put on the next America's Cup. You say you're going to improve TV. What are you going to do? And Larry said in that interview, he said, well, I'm going to look up an old sailing colleague, Stan Honey, and we're going to put ladder lines and ley lines and mark circles. And so he was referring to a conversation we'd had 15 years before. And I was in the Southern Ocean, on Groupama 3, we're setting the round the world record. And Sally saw this interview because I was mentioned by name and it came up on Google or something. So she sends me she converts it to text and sends me by satellite a text reading. And I was absolutely blown away that Larry remembered the conversation. And that it was a rare opportunity as a freelancer where you get a hunch as to what you might have a chance to do next. So when I got in from the setting the round the world record, there was a bunch of emails and stuff, and I followed up on it. And Jimmy Spittle and Russell Coots, working for Larry, wanted to investigate doing what became the LiveLine system, meaning from the helicopter video, putting in the ladder lines and the ley lines and all that. And I mentioned what I had told Larry 15 years earlier, that we could do it and it would work, But this stuff is expensive, and it normally only makes sense for major sports like football, baseball, NASCAR. And they said, well, tell us what it would cost. So I dragged in Ken Mills, as always, and we figured out an estimate of what it would cost. And we figured it would cost, in those days, it was $5 million in 2 years. But we said, look, this will work. We can get it to work, because technically it's all stuff that we know how to do. It's just a lot of work, because you got to have RTK tracking on all the boats. You got to have an extraordinarily good INS in the helicopter to measure its angle to 100th of a degree. But you can do that. It's just money, and then you got to have the telemetry system that covers this whole very large field of play that's much bigger than, say, a NASCAR track. And so we said, we don't think it makes economic sense, but we could do it. It would work. It'll be great, but it's way too expensive. $5 million. And they said, go ahead. So we did it, and it came out exactly on budget and exactly on schedule, and everything worked, and it was a terrific contribution to the sport. But it was expensive, and it remains to be seen whether it's it will eventually get affordable enough to be useful for the rest of the sport of sailing, because technology always drives things down in cost. But at the time we did it, it was just really expensive to do because of the cost of the sensors and the telemetry.
Well, there was a system out there that would tell you where the boats are and things like that.
Yes, that's easy, and that was pioneered by Alan Trimble, actually, who's an ex-SGI guy who worked in this building. But Alan Trimble pioneered that at the America's Cup in San Diego, decades earlier. And then Alan Trimble was also a guy who played a key role in the Yellow Line, because Alan had gotten dragged into working at ESPN. And in the Yellow Line business, when we were trying to convince Jed to present the Yellow Line, Jed's response was, I'm backtracking, but I think you'll find it interesting. Jed's response was, hey, I'd love that, but how do I know it'll work? And I knew that I couldn't explain how it would work to Jed, but I also knew that Alan Trimble worked for Jed, and I knew that Alan Trimble was an ex-SGI technologist. So I said, here's what you do. Send Alan Trimble to Sportvision to spend 3 or 4 days, and then you can ask him. So he sent Alan Trimble down, and Alan Trimble spent 3 days with us. And Alan went back to Jed, and he said, Jed, I'm not going to explain to you how it works. I'm just going to tell you that these guys will get it to work. It might be late, but it will work. And so the question you have to face, Jed, is whether you get the Emmy or somebody else gets the Emmy. But it will happen. And that's what it took. But so now Alan Trimble was a key guy that's kind of woven in and out of all these things. He did the original tracking in virtual reality in San Diego at the America's Cup. And by virtual reality, I mean you're looking at a completely computer graphic synthetic view of the race. And then he was a key guy in our K-Zone project, and he was a key guy at Espen believing that we could do the Yellow Line, which enabled Sportvision to succeed. And then when it came time to do the LiveLine, I needed somebody to operate LiveLine who understood sailing and understood production TV. Now, Alan Trimble meanwhile, he had left TV. He'd gone back to school, gotten his PhD in marine biology, and he was a professor in marine biology in Washington. So I called up Alan and said, Alan, I need your help. I need you to be the operator of the LiveLine system, because you're the only human that understands augmented reality and understands sailing and understands TV production. You're the only one that could do this. And so Alan actually took a leave of absence from his professor job and then became the operator of LiveLine. So he was a key guy through the whole process. And in fact, Alan, I think, attended the meeting in the very first stages of the hockey puck project. I think Alan was in the meeting I had here with Jim Clark and Rupert Murdoc to talk about the hockey puck project, between News Corp and SGI. So yeah, he's woven all through.
Well, let's see. We've covered a lot of territory. I think put your story together very nicely. Is there anything else we should add? I have one item, but you could tell me yours first.
Why don't you do yours first, I'll think.
Okay, well, you mentioned Sally. Could you tell us the charming story about how Stanley met Sally?
Sally is a legend in sailing. It's Sally Lindsay, the woman I married, now Sally Lindsay Honey. She was one of the few women who competed in open sailing competitions, meaning she also did women's events like the Adams Cup and won that, but she competed in 505s against the men and, won the North Americans and was, one of the top competitors in the 50 class. And then she was a sailmaker. She started her own business in sailmaking, and then she was head of spinnaker design for North. And then I ran across Sally when I went to Yale and joined and was, living at Yale. I ran across Sally both through 505 sailing, because I was crewing in 505s for Steve Taylor, who also worked at North Sails, in fact was Sally's boss at North. And then I also ran across Sally because I, at the time, was driving a Volvo 122. And Sally, as it happens, had a 122 that wouldn't run. It was broken. And she heard that I knew a lot about those cars, so she towed it over to the Yale Yacht Club, and then I fixed it for her. So that's, I think, the first time we actually met in person. But nevertheless, I was crewing for Sally's boss in 50s. Sally was sailing her own boat. And then we got to know each other that way. And then ultimately, I started sailing with Sally, crewing for Sally. And then when I graduated from Yale and moved out here, I talked Sally into coming with me. And so she moved out to the West Coast. And then she started her own business in Palo Alto, a business that had two names: the Spinnaker Shop, which is a sail loft and precision technical sewing, a company that she did with all the same people and all the same equipment, but she did all the heat shields for satellites and robot arm covers and almost everything for SRI and Lockheed and Ford Aerospace and whatnot. But she was providing everything anybody in the valley needed that was sort of one-off, precision built out of cloth. She would do that business, and then she sold that now, I think, about 10 years ago. And then we got married, I think, 20 years after we first met. So now we've been together for 40 years. Yeah. She wanted my frequent flyer miles, so she finally agreed to marry me.
Okay, well, that's great.
But yeah, Sally was twice the Yachtswoman of the Year for the U.S., so she's highly decorated.
So for all of that, the perfect match. Do you have family? Children?
One son.
One son.
Tam, who lives in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, okay. Is he a sailor?
He's a recreational sailor, and he does, some light racing. And then he works in IT, for a company. And then he's married to Janelle, who's also works in IT.
Okay. So, well, it's been a great pleasure to hear your story and bring it into the computer history literature officially. So, well, thank you. And I think
it's a pleasure. I can't imagine anybody easier to talk to about it than you, Chuck.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.